You've probably heard the claim before. Ancient humans spread across the entire planet using nothing but their feet and some basic boats. And every time someone says it, there's a temptation to nod along and move on without really stopping to think about what that actually means in practice. Because when you genuinely sit with it, the scale of what ancient humans accomplished in terms of travel and migration is honestly one of the most staggering stories in all of human history. People reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago. They crossed open ocean to colonize tiny specks of land scattered across the Pacific. They walked into the Americas across a land bridge that no longer exists. They pushed through Arctic environments that would kill an unprepared modern person within hours. So how did they actually do it? Not in the vague, hand-wavy sense, but in the specific, practical, day-to-day sense. What did ancient long-distance travel actually look like, and what made it possible across such wildly different environments and time periods? Let's start with the most fundamental thing driving almost all of this movement, because it wasn't curiosity and it wasn't a sense of adventure. It was hunger. Hunter-gatherer populations moved because they had to, following animal herds during seasonal migrations, relocating when local plant resources became depleted, pushing into new territory when a growing population put too much pressure on the resources supporting them in a given area. The movement was almost never dramatic or heroic in the moment. A group might shift their range by only a relatively small distance within a single generation, but compound that modest repeated movement across hundreds of generations, and you end up with a species that has quietly walked itself from one end of the planet to the other without anyone ever consciously deciding to do anything particularly extraordinary. This is the part that tends to get lost in popular discussions of ancient migration. We imagine it as a bold journey, someone deciding to go somewhere new and far away. In reality, it looked far more like a slow tide, populations gradually expanding at their edges, each generation inheriting a territory slightly larger than the one before, until the cumulative result of thousands of years of incremental movement becomes genuinely breathtaking when you zoom out far enough to see the whole picture at once. Now, the physical capability side of this matters enormously, and it's worth spending real time on it rather than glossing over it. The human body is genuinely remarkable for sustained overland travel in ways that aren't always obvious from a modern perspective, where we spend most of our time sitting in chairs and cars. Human beings are built for long-distance movement in a way that very few other large animals actually are. The upright bipedal gait is mechanically efficient for covering ground at moderate speeds over extended periods. The sweating system allows the human body to regulate temperature during sustained physical exertion in ways that give us a real physiological edge over most other animals in warm conditions. And the human capacity for sustained moderate-intensity movement, not sprinting, not explosive effort, but steady, hour after hour travel, is genuinely impressive compared to most other species. Research on traditional walking-based societies has consistently found that covering 10 to 20 miles in a single day on foot, while carrying supplies, was a perfectly sustainable daily pace for populations whose bodies were conditioned for this kind of activity from childhood. Not an athletic achievement, just a normal day of travel for people whose lives required it regularly. But physical capacity alone doesn't explain how ancient humans successfully navigated genuinely unfamiliar terrain without getting lost, running out of water, or walking into conditions that would kill them. That part requires something different entirely. Environmental knowledge is probably the most underappreciated factor in ancient travel, and it genuinely deserves far more attention than it typically gets. Successfully moving through unfamiliar landscapes required an enormous accumulated body of practical knowledge that had nothing to do with written maps or formal education. Reading terrain features to understand where water sources were likely to be located, recognizing which plants indicated the presence of underground water, understanding seasonal weather patterns well enough to know when travel through a given region was viable and when it wasn't. This knowledge wasn't something individuals figured out independently on a single journey. It represented generations of accumulated observation, tested against real consequences, refined over time, and passed down through oral tradition with considerable care and precision. A group moving into new territory wasn't navigating blind. They were drawing on a deep inherited body of practical environmental intelligence that allowed them to read landscapes with a sophistication that would be genuinely difficult for most modern people to replicate without extensive specific training. Now let's talk about water crossings, because this is where ancient human travel gets genuinely fascinating and, frankly, where the achievements become hardest to fully wrap your head around. The migration out of Africa represents one of the most significant movement events in our entire species history, and the specific route matters. Genetic and archaeological evidence points toward a crossing at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow body of water connecting the Horn of Africa to the Arabian Peninsula. During periods of lower sea level tied to glacial cycles, this crossing would have been considerably narrower than it is today. Ancient humans weren't performing some impossible feat of open water navigation here. They were taking advantage of a geographic opportunity created by specific climate conditions that made the crossing genuinely manageable with relatively basic watercraft technology. This pattern repeats throughout ancient migration history. The Bering Land Bridge is the most famous example. During the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets locked up enormous quantities of water and sea levels dropped dramatically, a wide land connection between Siberia and Alaska was exposed. Ancient populations walked from Asia into the Americas the same way you'd walk from one field into the next, following game animals across what was, at that moment in history, simply ordinary land. The open ocean separating those two continents today didn't exist yet. They weren't crossing water at all. This is genuinely important for understanding ancient migration accurately, because the popular image of ancient humans performing miraculous feats of ocean crossing to reach the Americas is simply wrong. They walked. The geography of the planet was different, and they used those differences intelligently. Australia is a completely different story, though, and it's one of the genuinely great mysteries still actively debated in archaeology today. Even during periods of maximum sea level drop, reaching Australia from Southeast Asia required crossing a real, significant stretch of open water. Not a narrowed strait, not a land bridge, actual ocean, and the evidence suggests humans accomplished this at least 65,000 years ago, which makes it one of the earliest documented deliberate open water crossings in all of human history. What kind of watercraft did they use? We genuinely don't know with certainty. What level of planning and navigation was involved? Also unclear. But the basic fact is undeniable. Ancient humans crossed open ocean to reach an entirely isolated continent tens of thousands of years before the Polynesian voyaging tradition that usually gets credited as the great achievement of ancient maritime travel. It suggests that humans were experimenting with water-crossing technology far earlier and far more successfully than most popular accounts acknowledge. Polynesian voyaging, though, represents something categorically different in terms of sophistication, and it absolutely deserves the recognition it gets. Polynesian navigators colonized an enormous range of remote Pacific islands, separated from each other by hundreds or thousands of miles of open ocean. They did this using double-hulled outrigger canoes carrying entire founding populations, along with plants, animals, and supplies specifically chosen to establish a viable permanent settlement upon arrival. This wasn't accidental drift. The deliberate inclusion of breeding pairs of domesticated animals and food plants aboard voyaging canoes makes it unambiguously clear these were planned colonization expeditions by people who fully expected to find land and intended to stay. The navigation system that made this possible is one of the most sophisticated bodies of practical knowledge developed anywhere in the ancient world. Polynesian navigators memorized star paths, tracked ocean swell patterns to determine direction even on overcast nights, read cloud formations that indicated land beyond the visible horizon, and observed the specific flight patterns of seabird species known to nest on particular islands. These weren't separate tricks. They were integrated into a unified mental navigation framework passed down through intensive oral training and direct apprenticeship over many years. Polynesian navigators could reportedly detect an island they couldn't yet see purely from changes in ocean swell patterns caused by that island, disrupting the surrounding wave behavior. Modern researchers studying traditional Polynesian navigation have found this level of practiced environmental sensitivity genuinely difficult to replicate, even with dedicated training. It represents accumulated practical knowledge of an order that's hard to fully appreciate from a modern context, where satellite navigation has made the entire skill set essentially obsolete. Different environments produce different solutions, and this is worth emphasizing clearly. Ancient boat technology wasn't one invention spreading outward from a single origin. It was dozens of independently developed regional solutions, each optimized for specific local conditions. Reed boats in certain Mediterranean and South American contexts, dugout canoes carved from single tree trunks across river and coastal cultures worldwide, skin-covered frame boats in Arctic and subarctic regions where wood was scarce but animal hide and bone were available in abundance. The diversity of ancient watercraft design reflects the diversity of the water-crossing challenges ancient humans actually faced. The same principle applies to overland travel technology. Pack animals transformed the practical capacity for long-distance movement in ways that walking alone simply couldn't match. Horses dramatically increased travel speed across open terrain. Camels opened up desert routes that would have been brutally difficult to traverse, relying purely on human endurance. The camel's physiological ability to go extended periods without water, combined with its tolerance for extreme heat and difficult terrain, made it genuinely indispensable for travel across the Sahara, the Arabian Peninsula, and large portions of Central Asia. The development of effective camel saddle technology that allowed riders and cargo to be properly balanced was itself a significant practical innovation, transforming camels from useful pack animals into efficient long-distance desert transport. In Arctic environments, the problem was entirely different. Extreme cold, limited food availability during large portions of the year, and terrain conditions that made standard walking impractical. The development of sled technology paired with dogs specifically bred for pulling represented a genuine solution to a specific environmental challenge, allowing efficient movement across snow and ice in conditions that would make most other travel methods dangerous or impossible. Rivers deserve more attention than they usually get in discussions of ancient travel. Major river systems functioned as natural highways throughout human history. They provided reliable water sources along the route. They frequently offered easier terrain than the dense forest or rugged mountains surrounding them, and once watercraft technology developed sufficiently, they allowed people to cover significant distances with far less physical effort than walking the equivalent distance overland. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, and dozens of other major river systems weren't just the settings for early agricultural civilizations. They were the transport infrastructure that connected communities along their length into integrated regional networks long before anything resembling modern roads existed. Trade was a major driver of long-distance movement that often gets overlooked in favor of migration narratives. Archaeological evidence regularly turns up materials, specific types of stone, distinctive shells, particular minerals, hundreds or even thousands of miles from their point of origin. This means ancient communities were connected through extensive trading networks, far earlier and across far greater distances than popular imagination typically assumes. Not necessarily through direct contact between distant communities, but through chains of intermediate trading relationships that moved goods steadily across vast distances, connecting people into surprisingly extensive economic systems, without any one individual ever traveling the full length of the network. Water management during overland travel through dry environments was a genuinely critical practical challenge that doesn't get nearly enough attention. Ancient travelers developed specific solutions, treated animal skins, shaped gourds, and eventually ceramic vessels engineered to minimize evaporation during extended travel through arid regions. But technology only solved part of the problem. The other part was knowledge. Knowing exactly where reliable water sources were located along established routes, information passed down across generations as essential memorized practical knowledge, frequently represented the actual difference between a successful journey and a fatal one. This point connects back to something running throughout this entire topic. The physical achievements of ancient travel are genuinely impressive, but the knowledge infrastructure supporting those achievements, the accumulated environmental intelligence passed down through oral tradition across generations, was arguably the more remarkable thing. Ancient long-distance travel wasn't primarily a story of extraordinary individuals doing extraordinary things through sheer willpower. It was a story of communities carrying and transmitting enormous bodies of practical knowledge that made difficult travel survivable and eventually routine. Genetic research has added a layer of precision to our understanding of ancient migration patterns that wasn't available through archaeology alone. By analyzing specific genetic markers and mutation patterns across modern populations worldwide, researchers have been able to reconstruct migration routes, estimate timing, and identify population bottlenecks where founding groups were small enough that their genetic signatures are still detectable in the populations descended from them today. This has confirmed some long-held theories about ancient migration routes and genuinely overturned others, giving us a far more detailed and accurate picture of how humans spread across the planet than we had even a few decades ago. What makes all of this genuinely remarkable, though, isn't any single achievement in isolation. It's the cumulative picture. Across tens of thousands of years, using technology that ranged from nothing more than their own 2 feet to increasingly sophisticated watercraft and animal domestication, ancient humans managed to reach and successfully settle nearly every habitable environment on the planet. Arctic tundra, dense tropical rainforest, isolated Pacific islands, vast desert interiors, high-altitude mountain environments. Each of those environments required specific knowledge, specific technology, and specific physical adaptation to survive in, let alone travel through. And ancient humans figured out solutions to all of them, not through any single dramatic breakthrough, but through the slow, patient, generational accumulation of practical knowledge tested against real consequences in real environments over vast stretches of time. The next time someone describes ancient humans as primitive, it's worth remembering that they successfully colonized an entire planet without a single map, without a single compass, and without writing any of it down. They just knew, and that knowledge, built piece by piece across thousands of generations, is honestly one of the most impressive things our species has ever produced.